You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I want to welcome back to the Final Say Radio Show. We have Charles Hoskinson, who is the opinion editor at the Washington Examiner. Chuck, it's great to have you back, and thank you again on such short notice. But as these stories just pop out of nowhere, we have to
thanks
keep
for
on
having
top
me. It's a big time for news.
Oh, sure. You can go all over the map if you wanted to in 10 minutes. But so Bowe Bergdahl, the Army Sergeant, and it's hard to say that, at least in my case, because there's so many questions that need to be answered surrounding this fellow, and things that have gone on since 2009 when he first walked off. But he's now cleared. He's being released back into service, and there are a lot of questions as far as, so what happens with him? Is he going to be just another regular enlisted soldier now? Is he going to collect back pay? Is he going to go back into some sort of training mode? Have you heard anything along those lines?
Well, considering, he's an Army sergeant in good standing, and when I say that, it means that he's not been charged with a crime. He's not under any kind of disciplinary restrictions, and he's getting paid as an Army sergeant. So the Army wants to get its money's worth out of him. Now that he's been cleared for duty, he's going to go and he's going to get put to work, just like any other sergeant. I'm sure, there are still a whole lot of questions emerging from his captivity, and those questions are being investigated. But while they're being investigated, as long as he hasn't really been found responsible for any kind of disciplinary matter, he's going to end up working like any other enlisted non-commissioned officer, any other non-commissioned officer on that base.
Now that's interesting, and I agree. To be fair, in this country, you're innocent until proven guilty. So, of course, I think, whether we like it or not, it seems to be the appropriate action. But I guess this question pops into my mind that I would assume that there's no chance that they would put him into, send him overseas or put him into some sort of situation where he's commanding a company, not commanding, but, leading a company as a sergeant. And I guess the secondary question is how his fellow troops feel about him being back into the service right now.
Well, they've put him in it looks like they've put him in a desk job at the U.S. Army North Command in Fort Sam Houston in Texas, in San Antonio. It's the same post where he was treated at the hospital. This is going to give the Army an opportunity to get the taxpayers' money out of him, in terms of getting their value for his salary, without putting him back into an infantry line unit, as you mentioned, in a leadership role. He may not be judged to be ready for that. It also lets him stay available to the investigators who are looking into his case. As for his fellow soldiers, it looks like, the people who work with him may have their opinions about him, but they're not going to be allowed to really, that's not going to be allowed to affect their interpersonal relationships with him on a professional basis. The people in charge of Bowe Bergdahl right now are going to probably have some kind of mandate to make sure that the office he's working in continues to operate smoothly without any kind of interpersonal conflicts related to his captivity.
Right. Well, that's a good point. We are the most professional Army that exists in the world, at least most of the time. And I would assume that the command would handle that situation, but it's got to be tough. I'm sure there will be talk behind the water cooler or off base when guys have to deal with this situation, particularly as the investigation and further information may come out.
And it's going to be tough on, as a former Army officer myself, I know it's going to be tough on his commanders. They're dealing with somebody who's effectively in limbo, and they have to have him soldier on and have everybody around him soldier on while his case is being decided, and they've got to manage that.
Yeah, Chuck, it's a really tough position for them. Short analysis here. If you think about our military men and women and the ethos, that leave no man behind ethos, that they are all, completely, it's just baked into their DNA, to yield a cohesive fighting machine. That's what makes this such an unusual case. The number of people who immediately came out, it wasn't like, hey, some people thought he might have been taken by the bad guys. It seemed like all the people who knew him in his unit immediately threw him under the bus as being a fifth column kind of guy. Now, we do have an innocent until proven guilty, but you have to take that in the background. Now, if you couple that with the fact that Team Obama seems to have learned nothing from the Fort Hood massacre, and this entire thing seems to fly, the entire way they've handled it seems to fly in the face of prudent security measures, of basic common sense. So, Chuck, is there any precedence that you know of out there for such a strange set of circumstances and such a bizarre move, even in the course of World War II or Vietnam, for example?
In terms of, are you talking about in terms of the trade to get him back, or are you talking about in terms of how they would handle him once he got back?
I'm sorry, to really clarify. I think the way that he was so quickly, without a proper vetting, without what appeared to be an appropriate, quiet, prudent, to be basically held up as a hero without even an investigation, and then put back into service, the whole thing, something is really bizarre here. It's just out of sync. It doesn't feel like anything that you would normally see under any other leadership at any other point in time.
Well, it was a mistake for the administration to prejudge his case for public relations reasons, as they did, to bring him back and hold him up as a hero. But it's also a mistake for folks to try to prejudge his case in the other direction at this point. There seems to be a great deal of information that indicates that he fell into Taliban custody because of his own actions, because of actions that were probably not the actions he should have taken as a soldier. And for that reason, if for no other, the Army's investigation needs to be very, very carefully monitored by folks to make sure that there is no whitewash or cover-up. A lot of his platoon mates are concerned that this may happen, and they've expressed that concern. But right now, the precedent is that he's a soldier in good standing. He's been medically cleared for duty, and he needs to go back to duty. It does show. The Army has shown that some sensitivity to the situation. They didn't put him back into a combat unit in a leadership role. They put him in a desk job. That's helpful. That also gives them some time to look into his case and decide what they want to do. And the options are pretty simple. I mean, they can choose. They can clear him. The investigation could clear him. The investigation could reveal things that might lead to him being administratively separated from the Army. The investigation might lead to things that would cause him to be court-martialed. And in each case, the way they handle him is going to be different in each of those circumstances.
Well, my understanding is they haven't even done a full review yet of the case. So to put him in even an administrative role, even if he's at a desk with a computer and a phone, he can do damage. So let me play the suspension of disbelief game, because I often like to do that. The only logical scenario that I could imagine for the way some of this is played out would be sloppy handling of a U.S. double agent. In other words, if this guy was actually trained to meld into a unit and then at some point slip into the night and seem like a guy who has empathy for the enemy, and then at some point we take him back in when it's appropriate. But again, I think that's an enormous suspension to disbelief, especially because of the nature of POTUS. So it feels a lot like wishful thinking, but I'm just trying to open up logical alternatives. I mean, have you scratched your own mind and come up with your own thesis that says this is too bizarre, there must be more to the story, that maybe they're not just not telling us, but maybe they can't tell us?
There's probably a lot to this story that they're not telling us. It seems, if I had to speculate, I would say the most likely situation is that of a soldier who got tired of the war and decided he'd just walk away from it, ended up in the hands of the Taliban, and got more than he bargained for out of it.
Now that goes back to the precedence question. We have to have had circumstances many times in the past where somebody walked away from the U.S. military service, ended up in a jungle in Southeast Asia or someplace else, ended up falling into the enemy's hands. Do you know offhand if we typically treat our AWOL people the same as we would a normal captured prisoner under such circumstances?
Well, if they went AWOL, they would be treated differently. I covered a case several years ago of a man named Charles Jenkins. He was a young farm boy from North Carolina, ended up stationed in South Korea, I'm sorry. He ended up being stationed in South Korea, and in 1965, he walked off his post right into North Korean hands, and he stayed in the hands of the North Koreans hands of the North Koreans for almost 40 years. And when he came back to Japan and got back into Army custody in Japan, he was court-martialed. And in a plea deal, he pleaded guilty to charges of desertion, aiding the enemy, was sentenced to 30 days confinement, received dishonorable discharge, reduced to private, and that was the end of it. And the guy, I think he was, at that point, he was in his 60s when this happened. And he was a young guy when he was about 25 when he defected. And when he came back, he was in his 60s, and they got him a new uniform and put him on trial in Japan. Court-martialed him for desertion. And as far as I know, he's still living in Japan.
Well, that's an interesting case. I can't imagine anyone making the decision to go choose North Korea as your new home, but definitely an interesting case. Just in the last moment we have with you, when I look at and I tend to agree with you, and I tend to agree with the Army's doing here. Just put him at a desk job, doing whatever he's, pushing papers around, doing, clerical stuff, whatever. Nothing significant. I would have to say, I can't see how this guy will be in a position where he could do the kind of damage that we saw from a Daniel Manning or a Snowden or someone of that nature. So I think and hopefully they do a very thorough, in-depth, and on the up and up investigation into everything that would happen and do the right thing by not just him, but we know we've lost some men out in the field who were looking for him, or other men who were hurt or lost as a result of his disappearance. And, of course, we want to ensure that we see justice for everyone involved.
Well, I suspect he's in a position where he doesn't require security clearance. And I would hope that the Army would be smart enough to not give him one at this point. It's a good question for an enterprising reporter to ask.
Well, we would make such assumptions, but then again, this is an interesting administration. Anyway, Charles Hoskinson, he's the opinion editor with the Washington Examiner. Thank you so much for joining us today and covering this story, and I'm sure there'll be more as the weeks and the months unfold on this particular story. But again, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, I'm sorry, real quick, could you give the website so our listeners can go check you out and your other articles?
Our website is WashingtonExaminer.com.
Great. Excellent. Okay. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
You too. Take care.